When my brother and I left the orphanage, they warned us to stay away from the farm. I'm Sarah, and I'm 23 years old now, but back then I was just 17, scared out of my mind, and standing in the parking lot of St. Catherine's Home for Children with everything I owned stuffed into 2 garbage bags. My brother Tommy was 19, tall and skinny with that same nervous energy he'd had since we were kids, bouncing on his heels like he always did when he was anxious. We spent our entire lives in that place, dropped off when I was 3 and Tommy was 5, after our parents died in a car accident that I'm still too young to remember clearly. All I have are fragments, little pieces of memory that might not even be real, just stories I've told myself over the years to fill in the blanks. The director of the orphanage, Mrs. Patterson, stood on the front steps with her arms crossed, watching us like she was waiting for us to screw something up one last time. She'd never liked us much, especially Tommy, who had a habit of asking too many questions and getting into places he wasn't supposed to be. But that day, her expression was different. It wasn't the usual irritation or disappointment. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like fear, and that made my stomach twist into knots because Mrs. Patterson wasn't afraid of anything. She'd run that orphanage with an iron fist for 27 years, and I'd never seen her back down from a confrontation with anyone. Not even the police officers who came around asking questions about funding, or the social workers who tried to tell her she was too strict with the kids. Tommy grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight, and I could feel how sweaty his palm was. We'd been talking about this day for years, planning our escape from St. Catherine's like it was some kind of prison break. But now that it was actually happening, neither of us seemed ready for it. Where were we supposed to go? What were we supposed to do? We had $47 between us, no job prospects, no family to take us in, and no real plan beyond getting as far away from that place as possible. But then Mrs. Patterson did something completely unexpected. She walked down those steps, slowly, deliberately, and handed Tommy a manila envelope that looked old and worn, like it had been sitting in a drawer somewhere for a very long time. "This belonged to your parents," she said, her voice flat and emotionless in that way she had when she was trying to hide something. "I was instructed to give it to you when you both came of age and left our care. There's information inside about a property in Milbrook Valley, about 43 miles north of here." "It was your family's farm." Tommy's eyes went wide, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. A farm? Our parents had owned a farm? In all the years we'd been at St. Catherine's, nobody had ever mentioned anything about property or family land or anything that suggested we came from somewhere real, somewhere that existed beyond the grey walls of that orphanage. Mrs. Patterson's jaw tightened, and she leaned in closer, dropping her voice to barely above a whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not go to that farm. Do not try to find it. Do not ask questions about it. Sign whatever papers you need to sign to transfer the deed, sell it sight unseen, and use the money to start your lives somewhere far away from here." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't a suggestion or a recommendation. It was a warning, delivered with the kind of intensity that made it clear she wasn't just being her usual controlling self. She was genuinely frightened of something, and that fear was real enough to make her break character completely. Tommy looked at me, and I could see the same questions in his eyes that were racing through my mind. Why would she warn us away from our own family's property? What could possibly be so dangerous about an old farm that had been sitting empty for probably close to 2 decades? And more importantly, why had she kept this information from us all these years, only giving it to us now when we were literally walking out the door? "What's wrong with it?" Tommy asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What's at the farm that you don't want us to see?" Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually tell us the truth, whatever that was. But then she straightened up, pulling that professional mask back into place, and shook her head firmly. "I've said what I needed to say. What you do with that information is your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you." "Tut!" Then she turned on her heel and walked back into the orphanage without another word. leaving us standing there in the parking lot with more questions than answers and a manila envelope that felt like it weighed about 50 pounds, despite being mostly empty. We found a bench at the bus stop down the street and tore open the envelope right there, both of us crowding together to read the contents. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a deed to 162 acres of farmland in Milbrook Valley, registered to James and Catherine Hartley, our parents, dated 1998. The second was a letter, handwritten on yellowed paper that had clearly been folded and unfolded many times over the years. Tommy's hands were shaking as he spread it out on his lap, and I leaned over his shoulder to read the familiar handwriting that I recognized from the single birthday card we had from our mother, the only thing of hers we'd been allowed to keep. "My darling children," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then your father and I are gone, and I pray that you've grown up safe and loved, though I fear that may not be the case. The farm has been in the Hartley family for 4 generations, passed down from parent to child, and now it belongs to you. But I need you to understand something before you decide what to do with it. The land is not what it seems. There are things buried there, secrets that we tried to escape but could never fully leave behind. Your father wanted to sell it, to break the cycle, but I couldn't bring myself to let go of the only connection we had to our family history, even though that history is darker than you can possibly imagine." The letter continued, and my mother's handwriting seemed to get more frantic as it went on, the letters slanting and crowding together like she'd been writing in a hurry or under some kind of emotional distress. "There's a reason the farm has been abandoned by everyone who's tried to work it. There's a reason the neighbors in Milbrook Valley cross the street when they pass our property line. Your great-great-grandfather, Samuel Hartley, did something terrible on that land back in 1923, something that the family has been paying for ever since. I don't have time to explain everything, and honestly, I'm not sure I understand it all myself. But I need you to know that if you go there, if you try to reclaim what's yours by right, you need to be prepared for what you'll find. The past doesn't stay buried on Hartley land. It has a way of coming back, of making itself known, and once you set foot on that property, it will know you're there. Please, my darlings, be careful, be smart, and if you feel like something is wrong, if you get that feeling in your gut that tells you to run, then run and don't look back. I love you both more than life itself, Mom." Tommy and I sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably only about 15 minutes. Cars passed by. People walked their dogs. The world kept moving around us, but we were frozen in place, trying to process what we'd just read. Our mother had been afraid of the farm. Mrs. Patterson was afraid of the farm. And now they wanted us to be afraid of it too, to just sign away our inheritance and pretend like we'd never found out it existed. But here's the thing about growing up in an orphanage with nothing and nobody. You learn pretty quickly that fear is a luxury you can't always afford. We had $47, 2 garbage bags of clothes, and nowhere to go. The farm was ours, legally ours, and even if there was something weird about it, even if there was some dark family history we didn't know about, it was still shelter. It was still land. It was still the only thing in this world that actually belonged to us. "We're going," Tommy said finally, folding the letter carefully and putting it back in the envelope. "I don't care what Mom said. I don't care what Mrs. Patterson said. That farm is ours, Sarah. It's the only thing we have that connects us to who we really are, to where we came from. We can't just throw that away because of some vague warnings about family secrets and dark history. Every old family has secrets. Every old property has stories. That doesn't mean we should be scared of it." I wanted to argue with him, wanted to point out that our mother's letter didn't sound like she was just talking about normal family drama or regular old ghost stories. But I also knew he was right. We didn't have any other options, and besides, I was curious. For 17 years, I'd wondered who my parents were, what their lives had been like, why they'd ended up on that road on that rainy night that took them away from us forever. Maybe the farm had answers. Maybe it had pieces of them that we could hold on to, memories preserved in the walls and the land and the things they'd left behind. We used 32 of our $47 to buy bus tickets to Milbrook Valley, leaving us with just $15 for food and whatever else we might need. The bus ride took almost 3 hours, winding through small towns and farmland that gradually became more rural and isolated as we got farther from the city. Tommy sat by the window, staring out at the passing landscape with an intensity that worried me a little. He'd always been the dreamer between us, the one who believed things could be better, who held on to hope even when everything around us suggested otherwise. I was more practical, more grounded, the one who made sure we ate dinner and did our homework and didn't get in too much trouble with the staff at St. Catherine's. But now our roles seemed reversed. I was the one getting nervous, second-guessing our decision, while Tommy seemed absolutely certain that going to the farm was the right thing to do. The bus dropped us off in downtown Milbrook Valley, which consisted of exactly one main street with a handful of shops, a diner, a gas station, and a small general store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The whole town had this eerie, forgotten quality to it, like time had stopped moving forward somewhere around 30 years ago and nobody had bothered to wind the clock back up. There were maybe 12 people visible on the street, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing to stare at us when we got off the bus with our garbage bags. Not friendly, curious stares either. These were the kind of stares that made it clear we were outsiders, that we didn't belong there, and that our presence was making people uncomfortable. Tommy asked a woman outside the general store for directions to Hartley Farm, and I watched her face change the moment he said the name. All the color drained out of her cheeks, and she took 2 steps backward like he'd just told her he had some kind of contagious disease. "You're Hartley's?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're going out to that place?" Tommy nodded, trying to smile in a friendly way, but it clearly wasn't working. The woman shook her head rapidly, clutching her shopping bag against her chest. "That farm's been empty since 1989. Ain't nobody been out there in over 20 years, and there's good reason for that. You kids should get back on that bus and go back where you came from. Ain't nothing out there but trouble and heartache." But she gave us directions anyway, pointing north toward a county road that would take us about 7 miles outside of town, then told us to look for a rusted mailbox with the name Hartley painted on it in faded letters. The walk took us almost 2.5 hours because the road was all uphill, and we had to stop several times to rest and share the 1 bottle of water we'd bought with our remaining money. The sun was starting to set by the time we finally saw the mailbox, exactly where the woman had said it would be, leaning at a weird angle like it might fall over any second. The name Hartley was still barely visible under layers of rust and weather damage, and seeing it there, proof that this place really had belonged to our family, made something twist in my chest. The driveway was long and overgrown, more like a path through the woods than an actual road, and we had to push through bushes and step over fallen branches to make our way toward the house. But as we got closer, as the trees started to thin out, and we could see the property clearly for the first time, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The farmhouse was huge, much bigger than I'd expected, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and tall windows that reflected the dying sunlight in a way that made them look almost like they were glowing. The paint was peeling, and the wood was weathered, but the bones of the house were solid, and I could imagine what it must have looked like when our parents lived here, when it was still a working farm with life and activity and purpose. Hey, if you're getting invested in Sarah and Tommy's story, I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button and join our community. We share real stories about family, inheritance, and uncovering the past every single week. And I'm really curious, if you found out you had inherited a property that everyone warned you to stay away from, would you go anyway, or would you listen to the warnings? Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you would do in their situation. Would curiosity win, or would caution keep you away? Tommy dropped his garbage bag on the porch steps and just stood there, staring up at the house like he was seeing something holy. "This is ours," he whispered, and I could hear the emotion cracking through his voice. "Sarah, this whole place is actually ours. We have a home, a real home." I wanted to share his excitement. I really did, but something about the property felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. The house itself was beautiful in that sad, abandoned way that old buildings get when they've been left alone too long. But there was something else, something in the air, or the way the shadows fell across the yard that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The farm was quiet, too quiet for a place that should have been full of bird sounds and insect noises and all the normal things you'd expect in the countryside. It was like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. We tried the front door and found it unlocked, which should have been our first real warning sign, but somehow wasn't. The door swung open with a long, low creak that echoed through the empty house, and we stepped inside to find ourselves in a front hallway that was covered in dust, but otherwise looked like someone had just walked out one day and never came back. There were pictures still hanging on the walls, furniture covered in white sheets, a coat rack by the door, with 2 jackets still hanging on it. It was like stepping into a time capsule, frozen at the exact moment when our parents had left for that fatal drive into the city. Tommy moved through the rooms like he was in a trance, touching everything, running his fingers along the dusty surfaces, picking up photographs and trinkets and setting them back down carefully. I found myself in what must have been the kitchen, a large room with an old gas stove, wooden cabinets, and a table that still had place settings laid out like someone had been expecting dinner guests who never arrived. On the kitchen counter, I found a journal, leather-bound and thick, with my father's name embossed on the cover in gold letters that had faded to a dull yellow. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and I started reading the entries from the last few months before my parents died. The early entries were normal, mundane stuff about farm work and weather and plans for expanding the vegetable garden. But as I got closer to the end, my father's tone changed dramatically. He started writing about noises at night, about feeling like he was being watched when he worked in the fields, about finding things moved around in the house when he knew for certain he'd left them somewhere else. "Catherine thinks I'm losing my mind," one entry read, dated just 3 weeks before the accident. "But I know what I've seen. I know what I've heard. The old stories about this land, about what Samuel did back in 1923, they're not just stories. There's something here, something that's been here for a very long time, and it's getting stronger. I can feel it watching us, especially at night. I've started keeping all the lights on after sunset, and Catherine doesn't question it anymore because I think she feels it too, even if she won't admit it." I felt cold reading those words, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the house. Tommy came into the kitchen carrying a box of old photographs, his face flushed with excitement, completely oblivious to what I'd just discovered. "Sarah, look at these. These are pictures of Mom and Dad when they were young, before we were born. And there's pictures of the farm when it was still running, with animals and crops and everything. This place was amazing. We can make it amazing again." I wanted to show him the journal, to tell him what Dad had written, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the look of pure joy on his face, the first time I'd seen him genuinely happy in years. Maybe it was the fact that we literally had nowhere else to go and $15 to our names. Or maybe it was just denial, that human ability to ignore warning signs when acknowledging them would be too painful or too complicated. We spent that first night in sleeping bags on the living room floor because we couldn't bring ourselves to sleep in the bedrooms upstairs. Not yet. Not when we didn't know which room had belonged to our parents. Tommy fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the journey and the emotional weight of the day, but I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle and creak around us. "Old houses make noise," I told myself. "That's completely normal. There's nothing supernatural about wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, but around 2 in the morning, I heard something that definitely wasn't the house settling. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the second floor directly above us. Heavy footsteps, like boots on wooden floorboards, pacing back and forth in a steady rhythm that went on for almost 20 minutes before finally stopping. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it or that it was some kind of animal that had gotten into the attic. But I knew what I'd heard, and more importantly, I knew that whatever was up there had known we were down here. The next morning, Tommy woke up cheerful and energetic, talking about his plans to explore the property, to check out the barn and the outbuildings, to see what kind of condition the land was in. I didn't mention the footsteps. I didn't mention Dad's journal. I just made us breakfast from the few supplies we'd bought in town with our last $15 and tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach like a stone. We spent the morning exploring the farm, and I had to admit in the daylight it was easier to see why Tommy was so excited. The property was massive, stretching out in every direction, with fields that had once been cultivated but were now overgrown with wild grass and weeds. There was an old barn that was structurally sound, despite needing some repairs, a chicken coop that could probably be restored, and even an ancient tractor sitting in one of the equipment sheds, rusty but potentially salvageable. Tommy was already making plans, talking about how we could fix the place up, maybe get some livestock, plant crops, turn it back into a working farm. He'd always been good with his hands, always the one who could fix things around the orphanage when they broke, and I could see him mentally cataloguing everything that needed to be done. But as we walked the property line, I started noticing things that didn't fit with Tommy's optimistic vision. There were places where nothing grew, perfect circles of dead earth, about 6 or 7 feet in diameter, scattered randomly across the fields. There were marks carved into some of the trees, symbols that looked old and deliberate, not like random vandalism, but like someone had put them there for a specific purpose. And strangest of all, there was a section of the property, maybe 20 acres in the far northwest corner, where the temperature dropped noticeably the moment you crossed into it. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate and dramatic, like walking from summer into winter in a single step, and the feeling I got standing in that cold zone was so intensely wrong that I grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him back across the invisible boundary. "Did you feel that?" I asked, and he nodded slowly, all the excitement draining from his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I felt it." "What the hell is that?" We stood there on the warm side of that invisible line, staring into the cold zone, and I realized that we could see our breath when we looked in that direction, even though it was probably 78 degrees where we were standing. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this land, and we were just starting to understand how deep that wrongness went. Tommy wanted to investigate further, wanted to walk into that cold zone and see what was at the center of it. But I refused. I had a visceral, instinctive reaction to that place that told me in no uncertain terms that going in there would be a mistake we wouldn't come back from. That afternoon, we decided to go back into town to ask questions, to see if anyone would tell us the real story about the Hartley farm and what had happened here. We needed answers, and we needed them before we made any more decisions about whether to stay or to follow Mrs. Patterson's advice and just sell the place sight unseen. The woman at the general store, the same one who'd given us directions the day before, saw us coming and actually tried to close the shop early, flipping the sign to closed and starting to lock the door. But Tommy got there before she could finish, holding the door open and pleading with her to just talk to us for 5 minutes. "Please," he said, "we're not trying to cause trouble. We just want to understand what happened here. This was our family's land, and we deserve to know the truth." The woman, who told us her name was Margaret, finally relented and let us inside, but she kept glancing toward the windows like she was afraid someone might see her talking to us. She made us sit in the back room, away from the front windows, and then she just stood there for a long moment, clearly trying to decide how much to tell us. "Your great-great-grandfather, Samuel Hartley," she finally began, her voice low and strained. "He was what folks around here would call a dark man. Not dark in his skin, but dark in his soul. He got involved with things back in the 1920s that no Christian person should mess with. There were stories about ceremonies out on that land, about people going missing, about sounds coming from the farm at night that made the neighbors sick with fear. In 1923, something happened, something bad. Nobody knows exactly what, because everybody who was there that night either died or disappeared or went completely insane." Margaret's hands were trembling as she spoke, and she kept wringing them together like she was trying to wash away the memories of whatever she was about to tell us. There were 11 people who lived on neighboring farms back then, good people with families, people who'd been part of this community for generations. After that night in 1923, after whatever Samuel Hartley did out there on his land, 8 of those people were found dead in their homes, not murdered in any conventional way, mind you. No stab wounds, no gunshot injuries, nothing that would explain how they died. They just died, all of them on the same night, and the coroner said their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror, like they'd seen something so horrifying that their hearts just stopped from the fear of it. The other 3 people went missing entirely, never found, never heard from again, and Samuel himself was found in his barn the next morning, hanging from the rafters, with symbols carved all over his body, symbols that nobody in town could identify or explain. Tommy and I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what we were hearing. This wasn't just family drama or old ghost stories. This was something real, something documented, something that had fundamentally changed this entire community almost a century ago. Margaret continued, her voice getting softer, like she was afraid the walls might hear her. The farm should have been abandoned right then, should have been burned to the ground and the land salted so nothing could ever grow there again. But Samuel's son, your great-grandfather William, he inherited the property, and he tried to keep it running. He lasted 9 years before he hanged himself in that same barn, in that exact same spot. Then your grandfather Thomas took it over, and he made it 14 years before he had a complete mental breakdown, started talking about voices and shadows and things that watched him from the corners of rooms. He died in a psychiatric hospital in 1978. Still raving about the farm and what was buried there. I felt sick listening to this, physically sick, because suddenly so many things made sense. The warnings from Mrs. Patterson, the fear in our mother's letter, the way everyone in town looked at us like we were walking corpses. This wasn't just about respecting family history or understanding where we came from. This was about a curse or a haunting or something even worse that had been claiming Hartley family members for 4 generations. "Your parents," Margaret said, and now there were tears in her eyes. "They were good people. Your daddy James, he tried so hard to break whatever cycle was happening on that land. He brought in priests, had them do blessings. He brought in some kind of specialist from the university who studied folklore and local legends. Nothing worked, and your mama, Catherine, she was pregnant with you, Sarah, when they finally decided they had to leave. They were driving into the city to meet with a lawyer about selling the property when the accident happened." What kind of accident?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Margaret looked at me with something like pity in her eyes. "Their car went off the road on a perfectly clear day, on a straight stretch of highway with no other vehicles around. The police report said it looked like your daddy had swerved to avoid something, swerved so hard that the car flipped 3 times before landing in a ditch. But there was nothing on the road. No animal, no debris, no reason for him to swerve at all. And here's the thing that nobody likes to talk about. The accident happened exactly 17 miles from the farm. 17 miles. Some of the old-timers say that whatever is on that land, it has a reach, a boundary. It can't let the Hartleys go completely. It won't let them escape." Tommy stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "That's insane," he said, but his voice was shaking. "You're telling us that some supernatural force killed our parents to keep them tied to that farm? That's not possible. That's not how the world works." Margaret just looked at him sadly. "You've been out there. You felt it. You know I'm telling you the truth, even if you don't want to believe it. Every Hartley who's tried to claim that land has either died or gone insane. Every single one. You two are the last of the bloodline, the last descendants of Samuel Hartley, and whatever he brought into this world, whatever bargain he made or door he opened, it's waiting for you out there. It's been waiting for 21 years for the Hartley children to come home. We left the general store in a daze, walking through the town without really seeing anything around us. Tommy was angry, I could tell, angry at the situation and at the unfairness of it all. We'd finally found something that belonged to us, a place that should have been our inheritance and our future, and instead it was a death trap, a cursed piece of land that had destroyed our entire family line. But I was thinking about something else, something that Margaret had said that stuck in my mind like a splinter. She'd said we were the last descendants, the last of the bloodline, which meant that if we walked away, if we sold the farm and never went back, the cycle would end. Whatever was out there would have no one left to claim. The Hartley line would be broken, and maybe, finally, after 102 years, the curse or the haunting or whatever it was could fade away into nothing. But when I suggested this to Tommy as we walked back toward the farm, he just shook his head stubbornly. "I'm not running," he said. "I've been running my whole life, Sarah. Running from foster families who didn't want us, running from bullies at the orphanage, running from every challenge and every difficulty because we never had any other choice. But this is different. This is ours. This is our family's legacy. And yeah, maybe it's a dark legacy, maybe it's twisted and horrible, but it's still ours. I'm not going to let some story from 1923 chase me away from the only home we've ever had a chance at having." That night, back at the farmhouse, I read more of my father's journal while Tommy went through boxes in the attic. The entries got progressively darker and more disturbed as they went on. Dad had clearly been researching the family history, trying to understand what Samuel had done and whether it could be undone. He'd found references to something called the binding, a ritual that Samuel had apparently performed to tie something to the land, something from somewhere else, something that didn't belong in our world. The journal entries suggested that Samuel had been trying to gain power, to make himself wealthy and influential, and that he'd succeeded for a brief time before whatever he'd summoned turned on him and destroyed him. There were sketches in the margins of the journal, symbols and diagrams that made my eyes hurt to look at for too long. And there were notes about the cold zone we'd found on the property, which Dad called the anchor point, the place where Samuel had performed the original ritual and where the connection between our world and wherever that thing came from was strongest. Dad had written, just 2 days before he died, "I think I understand now. It doesn't want to hurt us directly. It wants us to stay. It wants the Hartley bloodline to remain on this land, feeding it, sustaining it, giving it a connection to our reality. Every Hartley who's died here has made it stronger. Every generation has fed it more power. And now it's waiting for our children to be born, waiting for the next generation to begin the cycle again. Catherine and I have to leave. We have to break this connection, even if it costs us everything." And I was so absorbed in the journal that I didn't notice Tommy come back downstairs until he dropped a heavy wooden box on the table in front of me with a loud thud. "I found this in the attic," he said, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been excitement or might have been fear. It was hidden under the floorboards, like someone wanted to make sure it was preserved. I think it belonged to Samuel. The box was old, made of dark wood that had been carved with more of those painful-to-look-at symbols, and when Tommy opened it, I saw it was full of papers, old photographs, and what looked like ritual implements. Knives, bowls, candles, all arranged carefully and wrapped in cloth that had yellowed with age. Among the papers was a letter, written in handwriting that was similar to, but distinct from the other family documents we'd found. "To the inheritor of my legacy," it read, and I knew immediately this was Samuel's writing. If you are reading this, then you have inherited not just the land, but the responsibility that comes with it. What I accomplished here in 1923 was both a triumph and a tragedy. I opened a door that should have remained closed, made a bargain that I did not fully understand, and bound something ancient and powerful to this soil. It has given me everything I asked for: wealth, influence, power beyond measure. But the price was higher than I could have imagined. It wants to stay. It wants to remain connected to our world, and it will use the Hartley bloodline to maintain that connection. Each generation must choose whether to embrace this power or to fight against it. But know this: you cannot destroy it. You cannot banish it. You can only choose to work with it or to be destroyed by your resistance. Tommy was reading over my shoulder, and I could feel the tension in his body. "Work with it," he said quietly. "He's saying we could work with it. Use whatever power is out here instead of being afraid of it. Maybe that's what all the other Hartleys got wrong. Maybe they tried to fight it instead of accepting it, and that's why they died." I grabbed his arm, hard enough to make him look at me. "Tommy, listen to yourself. You're talking about making a deal with something that killed 8 people in one night. Something that's been claiming our family members for a century. This isn't power. This is poison. This is exactly what it wants. For us to think we can control it, to think we can use it, and then it will use us instead." But I could see that I was losing him. I could see the temptation in his eyes, the same temptation that must have caught Samuel and every Hartley who'd come after him. The promise of power, of finally having control over our lives after years of having no control at all. Tommy had always felt powerless, had always been at the mercy of systems and institutions and people who didn't care about him. And now here was something offering him the opposite, offering him strength and influence and the ability to shape his own destiny. It was exactly the wrong offer at exactly the right time, and I could feel him slipping away from me toward a decision that would destroy him. That night, I woke up at exactly 3 in the morning to find Tommy's sleeping bag empty. I knew immediately where he'd gone, and a wave of pure terror washed over me as I grabbed a flashlight and ran out of the house into the darkness. The farm at night was a completely different place than it was during the day. The shadows seemed deeper, more solid, like they were things you could touch or trip over, and there was a sound in the air, a low humming that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of my feet and into my bones. I ran toward the cold zone, toward the anchor point where Samuel had performed his ritual over 100 years ago, because I knew that's where Tommy would be. I knew he'd taken Samuel's box with all its implements and instructions, and I knew he was going to try to make contact with whatever was out there, to try to negotiate with it like you could negotiate with something that had been claiming human lives for a century. I found him standing in the exact center of the cold zone, surrounded by candles that cast flickering shadows across his face, making him look like a stranger. The wooden box was open at his feet, and he was holding one of Samuel's knives, reading from a piece of paper covered in words I didn't recognize. The temperature was so cold that I could see my breath in thick clouds, and frost was forming on the grass in a perfect circle around where Tommy stood. "Stop!" I screamed, running toward him, but it was like there was an invisible wall around the circle of candles. I hit it hard, bounced backward, and fell onto the frozen ground. Tommy turned to look at me, and his eyes were different. They were still his eyes, still that same hazel color I'd known my whole life, but there was something else looking out through them now, something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "It's okay, Sarah," he said, but his voice had an echo to it, like someone else was speaking the words at the same time he was. "I understand now. I understand what Samuel was trying to do and why he failed. He was afraid. He tried to take the power, but keep his humanity, and you can't do both. You have to commit completely. You have to offer yourself fully, and in return, it will give us everything we've ever wanted. We won't be powerless anymore. We won't be orphans with nothing and nobody. We'll be powerful. We'll matter." I was crying now, banging my fists against that invisible barrier, screaming his name over and over. "Tommy, please. This isn't you talking. It's gotten inside your head. You have to fight it." But he just smiled at me, that same gentle smile he'd given me 1,000 times when I was scared or upset, and then he drew the knife across his palm, letting blood drip onto the frozen ground. The moment the blood hit the earth, everything changed. The humming sound became a roar. The ground started shaking, and the temperature dropped so fast that ice crystals formed in the air around us, creating a glittering fog that made it hard to see. Tommy dropped to his knees, still holding the knife, and I watched in horror as symbols started appearing on his skin, glowing faintly in the darkness. The same symbols that had been carved into Samuel's body when they found him hanging in the barn. "No!" I screamed, and I threw myself at that barrier again, harder this time, putting all my weight and all my desperation behind it. And this time, something gave. I felt the barrier crack, felt it shatter like glass, and I stumbled through into the circle just as something began to rise from the ground beneath Tommy's feet. It wasn't solid, not exactly. It was more like a shadow that had gained mass, a darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence. It wrapped around Tommy like smoke, pouring into his mouth and nose and eyes, and I could see him fighting it, see him trying to resist even as it filled him up from the inside. I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, begging him to fight harder, and for just a moment I saw recognition in his eyes. "Sarah," he choked out, and his voice was his own again, fully his own. "I can't stop it. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. It's too strong. It's been waiting too long. You have to run. You have to get away from here before it takes you too." But I didn't run. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the journal from my pocket, my father's journal, with all his research about the binding, and how Samuel had tied this thing to the land. And I remembered what Dad had written about bloodlines, about how the entity needed the Hartley family to maintain its connection to our world. If it didn't have a Hartley on the land, if the bloodline was broken, it would weaken. It would fade. I looked at Tommy, at my brother who'd protected me and cared for me our entire lives, and I made the hardest decision I'd ever made. I started running, not away from the farm, but toward the house, toward the road, toward escape. Behind me I heard Tommy screaming, heard him begging me to come back, but that wasn't Tommy's voice anymore. It was the thing wearing his face, the thing that had been waiting for us to come home so it could complete the cycle that Samuel had started. I ran through the darkness with tears streaming down my face, ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. But I didn't stop. I made it to the road as the sun was starting to come up, and I flagged down the first car I saw. Some early morning commuter who took one look at my face and drove me straight to the police station in town. I told them everything, about the farm, about Tommy, about what I'd seen. They sent officers out there immediately, and they found Tommy in the cold zone, unconscious but alive, covered in those glowing symbols that faded as they watched. But he wasn't the same. The doctors at the hospital ran every test they could think of and found nothing physically wrong with him. But Tommy didn't speak, didn't respond to questions, just stared at nothing with empty eyes that didn't recognize me when I visited. I signed the papers to have him committed to a psychiatric facility, the same kind of place where our grandfather had spent his final years. And then I did what Mrs. Patterson had told us to do from the very beginning. I sold the farm, sight unseen, to a development company that wanted to turn it into a housing subdivision. I don't know if they'll succeed. I don't know if whatever is out there will let them tear down the house and plow under the fields and build new homes where the Hartley farm once stood, but I do know that I broke the cycle. I'm the last Hartley, and I'll never set foot on that land again. I'll never have children to pass the curse along to. The bloodline ends with me, and maybe, finally, after more than 100 years, that thing Samuel unleashed can fade back into whatever darkness it came from. I think about Tommy every day. I visit him twice a month at the facility, even though he never acknowledges that I'm there. Sometimes I wonder if there's any part of my brother left inside that empty shell, if he's trapped somewhere in his own mind, aware but unable to break free. The doctors say there's no medical reason for his condition, no brain damage or chemical imbalance that would explain why he's completely catatonic. But I know the reason. I know what's keeping him prisoner, and I know that it's my fault for not stopping him sooner, for not burning Samuel's box and everything in it the moment we found it. I carry that guilt with me every single day, along with the knowledge that I chose to save myself instead of trying to save him. Maybe that makes me a coward, maybe that makes me selfish, but I'm alive and I'm free, and the curse that destroyed 4 generations of Hartleys stops with me. I moved to Portland, Oregon, as far from Milbrook Valley as I could get, while still staying in the country. I got a job at a bookstore, found a small apartment, started building a normal life for the first time ever. I don't talk about my past. I don't tell people about the farm or what happened there. As far as anyone in my new life knows, I'm just an ordinary 23-year-old woman with no family and no particularly interesting history, and that's exactly how I want to keep it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that cold zone and the thing that rose up from the ground. I think about Samuel and his bargain, about how the promise of power can corrupt even good people, about how some doors should never be opened no matter how desperate you are for what might be on the other side. The farm is gone now, or at least the Hartley farm is gone. The development company cleared the land 6 months ago, tore down the house and the barn and all the outbuildings, razed everything to the ground, and started construction on their subdivision. I don't know if they encountered anything unusual during the demolition. I don't know if the workers felt the cold, or heard the humming, or saw the symbols that appeared in the dirt. I just know that I got a check for the sale of the property, enough money to pay for Tommy's care and support myself for a few years while I figure out what to do with my life. Blood money, in every sense of the term. But I took it anyway because what else could I do? The farm was our inheritance, for better or worse, and selling it was the only way to break free. Mrs. Patterson died last year. I found out through an obituary that someone from St. Catherine's sent me. The notice said she'd passed peacefully in her sleep, but I wonder about that. I wonder if she knew something more than she told us, if she'd been carrying the weight of the Hartley family's secrets all those years, waiting for us to age out so she could finally warn us. I wonder if she died peacefully, or if in her final moments she saw what she'd spent her whole life trying to protect us from. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some questions don't have answers that would make you feel better for knowing them. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'm writing this all down now, years later, because I want there to be a record of what happened. I want someone to know the truth about the Hartley farm and the curse that Samuel brought into this world. Maybe it's self-indulgent, maybe it's pointless, but it helps me process what I experienced and what I lost. Tommy is still alive, still in that facility, still trapped in whatever prison the entity created for him inside his own mind. I still visit him. I still hope that someday he'll come back to me, that whatever hold it has on him will weaken and break and he'll wake up and be my brother again. But I don't really believe that will happen. I think the price of breaking the curse was Tommy's soul, and I think I'll carry that cost for the rest of my life. The orphan girl who finally found a home, only to burn it down to save herself. That's my story. That's my legacy. And every single day, I live with the choice I made in that cold zone, the choice to run instead of stay, to save myself instead of dying with him. I don't know if I made the right decision. I just know it's the decision I made, and now I have to live with it. If this story resonated with you, if you felt Sarah's struggle and her impossible choice, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, real accounts of family secrets, inherited trauma, and the difficult decisions people have to make when their past catches up with them. This community is built on people like you who understand that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones rooted in family history and the legacies we inherit, whether we want them or not. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice between saving yourself and saving someone you love? What did this story teach you about the dangers of chasing power when you've spent your whole life feeling powerless? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable. This community is here to listen, to support, and to remind each other that we're not alone in facing the darkness that sometimes comes with our family histories. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.